So tonight we are going to spend a second night on the Decalogue, and as you know, when I was preparing it for the last time, I was like, whoa, there's a lot here, and there's just still way too much. Like, we could spend an entire study on one of the 10 principles, let alone trying to cover all 10 in one evening. And I was thinking about, I was like, if I talk 4 minutes on each one, that's 40 minutes. So some of them we're going to go through really quickly so that we don't spend a full 40 minutes talking about it. But it's also, one of the things is, we're going to be talking about it. It's like we're going to get principles for the principles of how we might or they could apply to us. But one of the good things is like Deuteronomy's got us covered, because we're going to reach the section that in a lot of ways feels inapplicable or dry or we don't like. But what it is doing is it is drawing from these principles and putting them into action for the Israelites when they enter the land. And so we're going to be able to look at it and be like, okay, so this may not be applicable to us, but what is it building on? What principle, and how might that principle look? So we're going to keep coming back to these because as we talked about the last time we met and we were talking about the Decalogue, one of the things about it is that it's a foundational document. It sets up how this covenant community is supposed to look, and its principles that can then be narrowed down into more specific commands. And it can also be broadened into just 2 commands: love God and love others. And so as we talk about it, we always have these other ways to think about it, and we will not be moving on from the Decalogue at all by any means when we move on to Deuteronomy, because we can't move on from it. It's the foundation for Moses, and it's the foundation for the prophets, and it's the foundation for Jesus, and it's the foundation for Paul. So it really is still our foundational document as well. As a quick review, we did talk about last time how it is a foundational document. Also, that one of the primary things to remember when we talk about the Decalogue is that it is given in a covenant context. It is not this universal, obvious moral standard that like everyone's just supposed to follow. He makes it very clear when he starts chapter 5, we were at Mount Sinai, and the preamble to the Decalogue states, I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. And so, as my people, as my covenant partners, here is how your community will look. The third thing we talked about, or one of the main parts, was that the audience that Moses is specifically addressing this was to male heads of household. And why that was important is because he is addressing it to the people who have the social, the economic, the political power, the influence, the ones who are basically running the community. And in that culture, not because that's the way our culture should be lived, but in that culture that those people lived in, that was who had the power. And then he gives them these 10 principles that, unlike our Bill of Rights, aren't protecting the powerful people's personal individual rights. It's actually making sure that the rights of everybody else are protected so that you don't have all of these people who've just come out of slavery turn into mini pharaohs themselves. One of the things that, one of the principles then is that we see that the more power and position you have, the more responsibility you have. And it comes up repeatedly in the Old Testament. The prophets will call it the rich. They'll call it the leaders. They will call it the priests. Ezekiel has a famous indictment of Israel between the fat and the skinny sheep, that if you have more resources, if you have more power, if you are using them to be self-serving, you are violating the very principles of the covenant of what the community is supposed to look like. And that continues into the New Testament as well, where teachers are called out, leaders are called out, the wealthy are called out. And what I think we need to make sure that we are constantly remembering is that we have this tendency to say, like, God's standard is even. You know, God has the same standard for everyone. And while he is holy, and we all must be holy like him, if you have more responsibility, if you have more resources, if he has given you more is expected of you. The standard is higher. And when we come to the Decalogue as us, we don't get off the hook because we're like, oh, it's written to male heads of household. We have social and economic and political power. We have influence in our world now. And so we are going to be looking at these to this time on what it requires of us to be covenant keepers who are looking out for the needs of others, because we are people who have been given responsibilities, and therefore we have to be caring for others. And when we look at this and what it's going to require of us to be keepers of the covenant, to be keepers of these principles, we want to constantly remember that we are keeping in mind the ways that it affects the others whose lives we have been given the privilege of having power and influence over, and how others see us as bearers of God's name. When I walk through these, I'm going to go through them quickly. Occasionally, I'm going to give a couple examples. But it's working out how what it means for me and what it means for you in the singular. These principles are creating a covenant community, but these principles are largely about what each individual is responsible for in creating the community. A lot of times when we look at the Old Testament, we have to put aside our individualistic nature because they were much more communal minded. They're much more addressing people as a community. But in the Decalogue, what we have is kind of a unique calling out of individual responsibility. All of the verbs are second person singular. There are no collective, like y'alls. There's no y'alls in the Decalogue. And while we are worried about creating this community, it is here that we see it depends on each individual. Like, we can form this community, but we have to form it together. And I have to take responsibility, and you have to take responsibility. And how that looks sometimes won't be the same. And so when I'm talking through these, I might be convicted of having to live it out one way, and it might look different for you. And I have to be careful that I can't necessarily dictate for someone else what it might look like to honor their father and mother, say, for example, because circumstances are different, and the amount of responsibility and power a person might have are all different. And one thing I want to make sure, as a person who has more power right now, because I'm standing up here and you guys are allowing me to teach you, that I am not somehow making the way I decide these should be interpreted in any way self-serving or in any way violate the actual principles of the covenant in the way that I teach them. Does that make sense? Because as a teacher in the New Testament, we are clearly reminded, I will be held more responsible for the ways that I help you guys understand these. And that is a weighty, weighty thing to come about, to have. And so I want to help us understand them without adding any weight of legalism, but without giving any excuse for, just fine, do whatever. And so we come at this prayerfully as we look at these 10 principles for our covenant commitment to our God. All right, so the first two I'm going to treat together. It starts in verse 7 and through the end of verse 10. I am reading out of the NLT tonight, and I chose this translation. It is the most dynamic of, I think, all the translations really out there, and most of us won't be familiar with it. It targets the target audience more in its translation, and so I chose it because a lot of us are very familiar with the language of the Decalogue, and this is different, so it helps us kind of jar us out of a familiarity. When we're really used to the way something sounds, sometimes we can just breeze through it without actually hearing it. So that's why I chose this translation for this evening. So Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 7. You must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind, or an image of anything in the heavens, or on the earth, or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these first two. One of the reasons is back in chapter 4, we heard almost this exact same language. And so we talked a lot about idolatry back then. So I'm just going to review the two principles we talked about that we see here. There's really two ways that Moses is saying, or God is saying through Moses, you can commit adultery. The first is that you can have another God. And in our culture, it's unlikely that people don't go and worship Asherah anymore. And very few people completely convert to something like one of the major world religions like Hinduism. But the purpose that God serves, the purpose that religion serves, is to give us security and purpose. Some people define it as answering the questions of where do we come from, what went wrong, and how do we fix it. But I think also what makes sense of the world and what gives us security and what helps us feel okay day to day. Just like the ancients wanted to please God so that the crops would grow, we too will serve something that will give us security that makes us feel like we have control over our lives. It might be the stock market. It might be politics. I can be, really good at investing, and then I have control because I have control of my finances. Or if I get really involved in politics, and I can have control over these laws that seem to be controlling my life. We can look for security in a lot of other things and not recognize it as a God that is truly dictating our lives, because we are worshiping that as that which brings us security. So there's idolatry, which seeks another God entirely. That's what the first principle is saying. You must not have any other God but me. But the second one, you must not make yourself for an idol of any kind. And he goes into all these images, which could be made, especially in that context, and they wouldn't be worshiping it as a god. They would say it was an image or a representation or something to do with their God. But Yahweh is very clear that you cannot take that which was created, not only that was created, but which he gave humans dominion over, and then worship it. That Yahweh cannot be represented or manipulated by making an image. This is what they did with the golden calf. Aaron wasn't presenting them with a totally different God. He was just giving them an image, something they could see and feel like they could manipulate. Like, here is something present. Here is something we can worship or bring offerings to or celebrate to, because you have that need to, I need to be able to manipulate it to make me feel better. And we do this all the time, baptizing things in the name of Jesus that may not actually be of Jesus, because it gives us something we can control. It gives us a way we can feel like we're doing something, a way that we feel that we're being religious. Or it's just our pet idea, our pet theology, the thing that gets us riled up. And that could be so many things. But we must really be careful what we are baptizing in Jesus' name. Because we may not be worshiping another God, but we may be worshiping something that is created, a system, a person, a church. And though those things are good, when we decide they are our gods, we have violated the second principle of our covenant. And Yahweh does not tolerate, he doesn't tolerate others. The word totally escaped me. That goes, he does declare he's a jealous God, and we talked about that too. I think it's Deuteronomy 4. I didn't look it up. So if you weren't there, you can go back and look where we talked about his being Elkanah, a jealous God whose passions are rightly inflamed when that which is his is given to another. The last thing I'm going to point out about these first two principles is this language of God laying the sins of the parents on the third and fourth generation. Because that kind of, in other places, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, he'll say he only punishes those who sin. So what does this mean? How is this affecting? Well, one thing that was really interesting when I was reading a commentary was it pointed out, at most, when you are alive, you will be 3 or 4 generations. So if you live, you will have children, and then you might have grandchildren, and if you live long enough, that would be the 4th generation. So in fact, what it's saying is not necessarily that God is punishing each generation, but what you do, if you are not faithful, if you worship an idol in any shape or form for whatever reason, that is affecting the entire family that is alive, because you were the head of that household. You are passing on that idolatrous, whatever it is, whether it's introducing in the ancient times an actual God into the household, or however we run our lives, what we look to for security, the things that we deem as important, the things that we spend our time listening to and allowing to influence our thoughts and the way we treat others and the way we talk about Jesus, that will influence our children, and the way we influence our children will influence their children. And sometimes it will be them being exactly like us, and sometimes it will be them completely rejecting us. But what we do influences, and if you're doing it, and if you are seeking other gods, however that might look, however those gods might be, you're going to affect every generation that you ever see. But God's lavish love is limitless. He doesn't mean 1,000 generations. He's not sitting there ticking off, counting to 1,000 generations. But then when people are faithful, the odds increase that the next generation will be faithful, and the next generation will be faithful. And so we have the choice to what we will see in our lifetime, whether we will be on our deathbeds sad that we have left a ruin, and we haven't set the generations up behind us in a way that will help them know the Lord, which will then help the next generations know the Lord. So we have that choice to see the fruit of it bear out, or to see sin not just tear apart our lives, but tear apart the lives of those that come after. This is not to say that God is not a God of redemption, because he is. He can redeem absolutely anything. And it's also not to say, as I've mentioned before, our situation is slightly different than Israel's, so bad things are still going to happen to us. There are no guarantees, and there's no right way to parent. But we do know that God is going to, if we can really, truly find him and serve him, that the next generations will see that, and he will be faithful to that promise. But as far as the laying the sins on the generation, it's more like in your lifetime, this is what you can cause to happen in your lifetime. All right, moving on. We could spend a long time on each one of these. The third principle is what I'm going to refer to as the name command. And it says in verse 11, you must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. I'm going to use it with his name just so it makes a little more sense. You must not misuse the name of Yahweh, your God. Yahweh will not let you go unpunished if you misuse his name. Now, the way you guys probably have heard this is you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. That's I think the most common language is take the name of the Lord your God. So we have this verb, and it's nasa in Hebrew, and it doesn't mean to take, it really means to bear or to carry or to take up. Like, so literally it means to like lift up and carry something. And somehow, I don't know exactly well, in Christian circles it came to mean like, that means you don't say God dang things, like, and that you don't say, oh my God, and like, we're gonna be really careful. And while I think there's a very good argument for our respect for the Lord and how we use his name, that's not what this isn't just about your speech. This isn't just about not swearing. Honestly, I think that is almost a trivialization. Like, we get 10 principles that are the founding ideas for how our covenant community should look, and we just reduce it down to like, don't swear. Don't say God's name flippantly. I think if he's going to give us 10 things, like if you could remember any 10, these are the 10, it should mean a little bit more, and it does. That verb to carry, to bear, with a name, like bearing a name. It's a very weird combination because usually that verb is used with actually like things, like carrying things. But it is used in Exodus when Moses is given the directions for the high priest's clothing. I don't have the reference, but in the high priest garments, if you look up that section in Exodus, the high priest is going to wear an ephod, and it's going to have 12 stones on it, and those 12 stones represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And then his shoulders will have 2 stones, and the names, they'll be split up 6 and 6 of the 12 tribes, and he is going to bear their names on his shoulders. So the only other place we see it is when the high priest has this garment on which names are written, and that is symbolic of him carrying the tribes of Israel before Yahweh when he makes atonement or when he does his priestly duties. That is the high priest's job. He bears the names. In other words, he represents the people before Yahweh. The priest also has a medallion that he wears on his forehead that says Kadosh Adonai, meaning holy unto the Lord. So he bears the name of the Lord upon his head because he represents the people to Yahweh, and he represents Yahweh to the people. And the people of Israel, if you remember back when we talked about Abraham, when we talked about earlier chapters in Deuteronomy, their job was to represent Yahweh to the nations, to their neighbors, and then to the nations. So when he's when he says, do not bear the name, let's see, this translation says, just not misuse his name, do not bear it emptily, do not bear it vainly. What he is saying is, don't misrepresent me. You bear my name. You are bearing the name no matter what. Israel has committed to God, so they bear his name. He has put his name on them. Everybody around them knows they are the people of Yahweh. Even if they worship other gods, if they start worshiping other gods, they look at them and think, no, they're Yahweh worshipers. That's what Israel does. That's their God. And so if they're going to be in a relationship with him, they represent him to everybody else who's watching. And he's saying, make sure you do it right. Made me think of, I grew up in a small farming town. Well, not teeny tiny. There's 5,000 people was the population. So it depends where you come from on whether you think that's large or small. So about 5,000 people when I was growing up. My high school class was a little under 100. My family had lived there for over 100 years. And so my grandpa had graduated from Plano High School. And my dad had graduated from Plano High School. And my 2 aunts and my uncle all graduated from Plano High School. My grandpa had been on the school board. My dad had been on the school board. My mom taught. I had a sister who was a valedictorian. A sister was salutatorian. And so, like, when I was going to school, like, I was a Wykes. Like, oh, that's a Wykes. Even to this day, if I'm back home and I might, like, be being introduced to someone, they'll be like, oh, well, she's a Wykes. Like, they don't know me as Megan Nesson, even though the Nessons have also been in that town. But I'm a Wykes. And when I would be in town, like, I, as my singular, also represented my family because everybody knew the family, or they knew me and knew I belonged to them. It's very strange then to take a name that people also recognize in that town, that they have a slightly different idea of sometimes. And so, like, that was like, oh, you're a Nesson? I'm like, yeah, but I'm a Wykes too. But I represented a family. I had a family's reputation almost to uphold. And that wasn't my duty alone. I was never laid with that burden, but we've kind of lost familial identity to a certain extent in our modern culture. But I was identified with someone. I was identified with people. For some people, it was my grandma. Like, as soon as, oh, you're Wykes, oh, you're Phyllis's granddaughter. Or, you know, are you John's daughter or are you Bill's daughter? Or there's just this connection. And it's the same for us. We bear his name. And so when we go out in the world, it doesn't matter if we're trying to be real Jesus-y, we bear his name. And when people see us, we represent that to them. So whatever they see, that's what we're doing. And God's like, now remember, you got my name on you. So if you act in a way that misrepresents me, I'm not going to hold you blameless to that, because you said you wanted to bear my name, especially when we start going out and saying, well, the Bible says, and this is how Christians act, and this is how you should act, and this is what the church should be about. You guys, do not do that lightly. It is the third principle. It is the third bedrock principle that God is saying, you are my people. That is a tremendous privilege. But it comes with a weighty responsibility, because what the world thinks of Jesus will be what they see in us. It doesn't matter what it says in the Bible, you guys. It doesn't matter that we have read these beautiful stories of God saying, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. You didn't have to do anything. It doesn't matter that when we get to the cross, we have a God who took on flesh. It doesn't matter. What they know of Jesus is what they see in us. When I was in grad school, I went to Wheaton College, which is a fairly well-known university in the suburbs of Chicago. And it's a suburb, like, it's busy. And I was commuting, so I had my parking sticker. And I'm not like the most road rage driver, but I get a little patient. I had to take like an interstate, like a Chicago area interstate to get to and from, and then like 4-lane roads with stoplights and just like lots of people. But I was very aware, like, once I got around like the Naperville Wheaton area, once I got off that exit and I was like driving to campus, like, I had a sticker that had the Wheaton College symbol. I've never been a fish person, but like, I was really aware, because then one day some jerk's tailgating me, whips around me, cuts me off. I was like, you have a Wheaton sticker. Like, that was just a little sticker. And I was like, you are identified with a, like, and Wheaton is, if you don't know, an evangelical Christian institution, has a pretty lofty reputation as being evangelical Christian. I had a reaction, and I was trying to be sensitive that, like, I wasn't a jerk on the road, wasn't cutting off people off. And that's just a little example. But like, if you put a fish sticker on your car, if you are wearing the shirts, if you're going to the church, if you're putting it in your bio on social media, you guys, we are claiming a name. And it is a worthy name, and it is an honor to bear it, and it comes with so much privilege and so much responsibility. I have always identified as an evangelical, and many of you might as well. It actually, historically, are people who agree with Bebbington's quadrilateral, if you want something really fancy, and it's Christocentrism and the Bible as central, personal relationship with Jesus Christ, 4 principles that you guys would probably all agree with. But there's actually been this shift now in the United States where evangelical is not identified with that. In fact, they have, it is now considered a political category. And I'm not giving up the title evangelical, but I want you to think about that people no longer identify it. Like, the name of Jesus it's always been slightly in America identified with maybe the Republican Party over the Democratic, but now there's like this subgroup that's like, oh, they're the Jesus Party. And you guys, we got to stop putting Jesus' names on things where it doesn't belong. We bear his name because we represent him to a world that is watching, and a world that is desperate to know something good. I mean, we have the news that he is Yahweh, the God who rescues you from the land of slavery, the God who brings you into a land of plenty, who has a future for you. Anyways, I could go on about this all night, but we bear his name. There's a great book called Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, if you're more interested in, if this is like a really new interpretation of this name command for you. I would highly encourage you to read it. It's encouraging, it's convicting, but I just want us to remember, like, there is so much more at stake than just whether or not we are saying OMG. That's another conversation for another time about how we do revere God, but this is so much more. In fact, the prophets in the Old Testament would say, thus saith the Lord, but God says, like, don't you dare say it. Don't you dare say, thus saith the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, if I didn't tell you to say it. And we should heed that same warning, that when we go around acting like we're talking for Jesus, and we are allowed, we have that privilege of being his priests, but we better remember that we are bearing his name, and as the old, it sounds cliche, we might be the only Jesus some people see, but we better make sure that we're showing them the true Jesus. All right, so we're through 3. All right, the 4th principle is about Sabbath. This is what I wish we could spend just weeks on, so we're just going to go through it really quickly. The Sabbath itself means rest. So we think of it in the Old Testament, it is Saturday, and the way it gets practiced, we kind of transition Sabbath to Sunday because that's when Jesus rose from the dead. But what's really surprising, I guess, I mean, it's not surprising because it's always been there, but I hadn't thought about it. But the Sabbath, that Saturday, is the first thing God declares holy. Like, it's not a thing, it's not a place, it's a time. Like, in Genesis, to rest is declared holy. Not making stuff, not acting the right way. Which made me reflect that the opposite of holy is profane. And profane doesn't necessarily mean bad, it just means further from God. So, like, you had to be pure in order to then get into, there's levels of purity as you trying to access the Holy of Holies in the temple. So the opposite of holy is profane, just mean not of God. It's further from the character of God. So if rest is what is holy, we have baptized activity in our culture. We have baptized busyness and productivity. Like, you are what you produce. You are what you do. You are what you contribute. And God's like, the Creator God, who is known because he makes something out of nothing, because he does everything, what he calls holy is not his act of creating, but his act of resting. And I think we get that so wrong, backwards sometimes. We try so hard to create and do and be busy, and God's saying, no, what is holy is rest. That how we live out that principle, how we live out that reality, that truth, that it is rest that is holy for each of us is going to be very different, and we could talk about that for hours, but I'm just going to leave us with that. That is resting that God declares as holy, not activity. The second thing is when Jesus comes on the scene, he makes that famous line, they're criticizing his disciples, like they're breaking the Sabbath rules. And he's like, the Sabbath was made for humans, not humans to keep the Sabbath. So we need to remember that it's a gift. We can come up with all sorts of rules or guidelines on how to keep this. And when I think of like the Jewish tradition of keeping it, there's so many rules, and we might get caught up in the rules. But when I read descriptions of Jews who practice and keep Sabbath, yeah, there's a lot of rules, and some of them seem crazy, like Sabbath mode on your oven because you can't turn on an oven and you can't turn on a light. But at the same time, like, it sounds so beautiful because it is a gift. Like, they have these, it's so embedded that it doesn't seem onerous to them, but rest, the Sabbath is a gift. And when we're constantly looking at it as like, okay, how do I keep it? What do I have to do? What do I have to take out? What do I have to not do? Like, we are bogging ourselves down to the point where we can't enjoy the gift that it is. He has given it to us so that we may rest. The 2 reasons that are given for this command, the first in Exodus, when the Decalogue is given the first time, is based in creation. That God was active for 6 days and he rested, so you follow that pattern. That rest is a gift, and that all activity comes with rest. We were not created to be ceaselessly and endlessly busy. But the second one is based in their slavery. So you were slaves. You know what it's like to work unceasingly. So you must rest because that is a gift, but also others rest. When we practice our Sabbath, our rest should not be a burden to others. And our rest, our practice of Sabbath, and keeping it holy, keeping it of God, keeping it somehow this sacred time, should not leave others with a bad taste of Jesus in their mouth. And one quick example I'm going to give, I still don't know what the best ways of practicing Sabbath are. That's something I'm still constantly working for to figure out. When my kids were young, it seemed like impossible. Like, I'm sorry, they need their diapers changed and they're going to eat 20 times a day. And like, if I don't at least do some dishes, like Monday morning, this is just going to be a mountain I won't get out of. So it's just something I'm constantly still always trying to work out. But one thing is, it seems in America that we think keeping the Sabbath means going to church. And let me tell you, that is not what is meant. When God institutes the Sabbath, when he's commanding them to keep the Sabbath, there aren't like weekly religious gatherings at this time. So it does not mean just keep the Sabbath, like keeping the Sabbath holy just doesn't mean make sure you go to church on Sunday so you keep the Sabbath. That might be part of the practice. And there's, again, like a lot of these, just because I'm saying that's not what this is saying, I'm not saying that there aren't plenty of other places in Scripture where God is encouraging us on the importance of meeting with the believers on a weekly basis. But so our tradition is keep the Sabbath holy, so you go to church. And then if you go to a good church, especially down here in the South, they dismiss before the Baptists. And that's important because then you can up the restaurants before they get super busy. And so that's our American Sabbath culture, right? Like we go to church in the morning and then we go out to eat. And I'm not here to pass judgment on that one way or the other. But what I do know from my time in the restaurant industry is that the worst shift to draw is Sunday afternoon because it's the busiest and it's the cheapest. Because the after-church crowd is known as the crowd who tends to be cranky and the most demanding and sometimes leaves the worst tips or even tracks instead of tips. If your rest and your observance of keeping the Sabbath holy actually burdens other people, you have forgotten that one of the purposes of the Sabbath is to remember you were slaves and you aren't going to be pharaohs. We cannot do that to the world that is watching. And this is our holy day and they are downtrodden. I know people who do not practice any commercial activity on Sundays. I have not reached that point. I don't know how I would do that. Like there are days when I go to Walmart, there are lots of Sunday afternoons we eat out. Is that right or wrong? I don't know. Again, I'm not here to lay legalistic rules on us, but to encourage us to look at how we practice those principles and what does it mean to rest and what does it mean to offer rest to those around us. I have a lot more, but I'm going to continue on because we could spend forever on the Sabbath. But just remember, it is a gift that God gives us and that we have the opportunity then to give to others. The next one is honor your parents. I'm going to draw our attention back to the original purpose, or the original audience, was male heads of household, all right? And so these male heads of household, they have taken over their family, right? They're running what feeds them. If there's any sort of economy or just the farming or whatever it is, they are the representative. They would be the leader who took the position in the gates if there was anything to decide. But that does not mean that maybe an elderly father was not still alive. And all of these people still live in the same household. So at its most obvious kind of basic meaning to that culture, honor your father and mother meant like, you better take care of them. Like you have control of the wealth and the house and the power and the influence, but they came from your father and he would still be in the house. So the idea is like, you have to take care of them. Even when they are past their productive lives and their time of power and influence are over, they are still valuable and we still care for them. And it creates this culture even more than just making sure they stay alive, where they realize that your life isn't over when you stop being productive. They honored their elders far more than we do because our American culture has so surrounded us with the idea, again, going back to the Sabbath one, that you are what you do. We are productive. And I'm busy and I have to do and I have to do, and that's where my identity comes from and that's where, my worth comes from. And so once you get to a certain age, like, okay, well, you had a good life, like go and I guess you just, I'll see you every once in a while. I don't know how that command is necessarily lived out for us. It doesn't mean respect. It says honor, not respect. And so when we're talking about parents, you guys, everybody's parents are like a different story. Everyone's experience with them. A lot of parents deserve respect. There are a lot of people whose parents have not earned that respect, who have hurt them, who have abused them. But honoring your parents, I think at minimum, and going back to the original context, means you care for them, you make sure they are cared for, you make sure they know that they are still valuable, that what they contributed mattered, that we recognize that we tell them that we include them, that we do not shuffle them off to Buffalo because, well, we just don't have time. We're a bit too busy being productive. Many cultures look down on me. You guys, again, I don't know how we fix all this in a day, but I do think that in the United States in general as a culture, we have lost a lot of our respect for the elders. Other cultures are shocked at the way we treat our elderly generation. And the first way we can remember to honor our parents, honor our father and mother, is to care for them and to let them know that they not only were valuable and did important things, but they are still valuable, and find ways to include them and allow them to still have value. And that's also going to shift the way we just think of growing old in general, which is a thing that we don't do well in this culture, and we fear, and we just kind of like don't talk about it. And I think as we honor our father and mother, it's just honoring life. It's an honoring of life that is still valuable, that age doesn't just kick us out of it. Also, the one final thing I will say about honoring our parents. I've talked extensively about this being something that protects the rights of others. So when we're talking about honoring your father, it protects the rights of parents who are past their prime to be cared for, to have access to the resources that were theirs, that they passed on. It protects the rights of all the people in the community, that they are valuable, no matter what their age. And so the one thing I'm not going to talk about is what it means for our children. Like if you have, if you're still in like the head of household state, what it means for your children to honor you. There are, again, other Bible verses that talks about how parents or children should be relating to their parents. But the problem is for me to decide what it means is that I benefit from what it means for my kids to honor me. Like if I think it means immediate obedience or that they can't say this, like I am laying out a set of rules that I get to benefit from. And it may not even, it just might be that my house is like quieter, my kids obey faster, or more than likely that people think I'm a really good parent because look how my kids obey me. Like, yeah, my kids honor me because I teach them the 10 Commandments, and so we have a really good Christian household. Like, I benefit. I'll just stick it with me. Like, if I enforce you are supposed to honor me because God says so, and this is how you're going to do it, I benefit from it. I am benefiting from it. And my responsibility in keeping this isn't necessarily to make sure I dictate my children's behavior so that they are really good, obedient little children who make me look really good. My responsibility when it comes to the principles of covenant commitment are to my parents. With the hope then that by seeing what I do and seeing the way I treat my parents, seeing the way I talk about my parents when they're not there with my spouse, or the way I talk about my in-laws with my spouse when they're not there but my kids are, that is what's going to teach them about how we treat our parents. So if we're worried about how we teach our kids to be obedient, I don't know. You guys, my oldest is 13 and he's got intellectual disabilities. Like, I am new on this and it's not going so well with my boys. But what I do know is that I believe that they will be most instructed by what they see me doing towards my parents. So my responsibility isn't to demand obedience from my children, but to make sure as a child that I am respectful and valuing of my parents and what they did for me. And that means, and if there's stuff that they didn't do well, then those are issues for you guys to work out in community, for yourselves, with the Holy Spirit. I can't come up here and give a principle for every single person in every single position. But again, when we come to these principles, it's about us. It's about me. And honoring my parents looks up It doesn't look down to my children. Guys, we'll go very quickly. All right. So murder seems pretty obvious. Jesus came around and said that also means do not hate. If you say you hated your brother, then you have committed murder. And then so some of us be like, well, I don't go around saying, like, I hate a lot of people. I mean, maybe some people. But one thing that I've noticed of late is our tendency to go back up for a moment. Jesus is saying that when we say, I hate you, that is the same as murder. And I think it's because language matters. When we say language like hate, we dehumanize a person. And dehumanizing someone, making them less than our level, is really powerful and effective because then it allows us to excuse and even commend evil behavior like murder towards them because we've made them, by our language, worthy of whatever harm we think should come to them. And we still do this. There's a really strong tendency that I really want to push back on of using words that are labels for an entire group of people, and then it's a group of people we don't like, so we use it as a put down. We use it as an insult. And when we do that, what we do, it's like, this is the worst thing I could say about you, and we strip them of their humanity. They're no longer an individual who has beliefs or thoughts. We no longer look at them as humans made in the image of God. We strip them of that, and then we excuse, either in ourselves or others, mistreatment of them. If that all seems very vague, I would suggest perhaps the use of the word liberal as an insult. Well, they're just a bunch of liberals. And in doing so, it's the worst insult, and it dehumanizes people. Or the opposite, they're a bunch of conservatives. My absolute least favorite that I will get in your face about is the use of the word that I've seen Christians use, is the use of the word libtard. Because we're going to combine liberal, because that's horrible, and retard, which is an actual name for a group of people with intellectual disabilities. And so what we're also saying then is there's nothing worse I could think of than being a retard, not being smart, being below a certain IQ. And for a group of people who supposedly say that we value all life, that this commandment, this principle is telling us that life matters, it's valuable, everyone's made in the image of God, by using those words, we manage to remove those people from like, well, here's humans, and then there's these people because they're this group. So we have to be really careful. The language we use, especially when we use a word for a group of people that like, okay, this is going to put you in a different group, and then I don't have to worry about you as much as a human. There is a reason that hate crimes can also just be speech, because language is powerful, and there is a pushback against language being a hate crime. But as I was reflecting on this, I was like, man, the world's laws in some ways are showing the principles of what it means to be God's covenant community more than the church does sometimes, because our freedom of speech does not get to come, our American freedom of speech does not get to trump God telling us like life matters and people matter, and we cannot continue to dehumanize them just because we don't like their ideas or their thoughts or their way they live their life. We are called to respect all life and be people who are pro-life, which means that we are pro-life for babies that are in the womb. We are pro-life for the elderly who still matter and don't need to be quietly assisted off of this planet just because they're old or not as physically capable. We are in favor of those with disabilities. We do not label them as worthless. That we look for the value, and we support and we promote all life, and we never use words that will segregate them off and allow us to excuse the stripping of life from the community. Adultery. You must not commit adultery seems pretty simple and easy. Jesus again expounded on this, saying like, if you lust after someone, you've committed adultery in your heart. And I think the reason adultery matters to God is because covenant commitment matters to God, right? It matters to be covenantly faithful, and the most obvious betrayal of covenant commitment is an affair. But also, our covenant commitment can wane and falter in a lot of ways, and that's only something you can know in your heart. It's only something I can know in my heart when it might not be lust. It could be resentment, it could be bitterness, it could just be apathy. I don't know what it is. There are lots of books and conferences that will help you identify that. And I think in some ways as women, we've been exposed to a lot of what it means to be a good wife. But again, a lot of those are rules and legalism, and only you can know, like, is my covenant commitment solely to this person? Have I let something detract? Have I given that love to another thing? Or even if it's not been given to another, have I just withdrawn it? And I would also remind you, even though I've been talking mostly about our responsibilities to be covenant keepers, to be keeping these principles, if you are in a marriage, you also have the right then to covenant commitment in sexual fidelity and abuse, neglect. Those are all breaches in the covenant fidelity, because if it's not something God would do to you, then it's not covenant commitment. God shows us what it looks like to be covenantally committed to each other. So yes, if you are married, you have a spouse who is owed, who has the right to your covenant commitment. But as a spouse, you are also owed that, not just in sexual purity, but in being loved. And next week we will see like what it means to truly love someone, not just with words, but in action. How many more do we have? Theft. Oh, jeez. Okay. Theft. All right. Don't steal. It's pretty obvious. Also in this world, there's ideas, there's intellectual property. We just have to remember that when it comes to theft, it's a matter of, are we going to be content with what God has given us? And are we going to trust in his provision? And that brings us back to the early chapters of Deuteronomy when they were coming in, and God was saying, like, you can't have this. Like, you're going to go through this land. Your land's over here. I've got what I'm giving you, but you can't have this. And a reminder that as God's children, we do not have the right to act petulant or spoiled. It doesn't all belong to us. He doesn't owe us anything. And we aren't better than anybody else. We are chosen and loved, but that doesn't mean like, oh, those people are there, they aren't in the community, and so I can have what's theirs. It's been the source of a lot of evils throughout history. So we have to remember that. I think theft a lot of times is a position of our heart, remembering like we're really not as important as we think we are, and we're not owed anymore, and we have been well cared for. We have been well cared for, you guys, especially as we sit here. Our bellies are full. We are warm. We have houses with heat. We have been so well cared for by our good God. False witness is the next one. You must not testify falsely against your neighbor. It's not lying, you guys. Like, this is not about lying. I'm going to go ahead and say it, and if God holds me guilty, like if the Nazis come and you need to hide the Jews and you lie to the Nazis, I'm okay with it. Like, I think God's okay with it. I didn't even know this was an issue, and then I read like all these like treatises on like how wrong it was, and I was like, I don't know. Like, I know people can be real legalistic sometimes, but this is actually this is not even what the commandments, this principle is about. It's about making a story up so that you can profit from it somehow. Whether it's just making yourself look better, maybe you're lying, and it's more of a judicial system. Maybe they were lying so that they could lie about where the boundary stone was, so they could get more property. Or just they don't like that person, so they're gonna make up stories about them. Or they heard something and they're gonna twist it just a little bit because it makes that person look worse. You guys, we do this all the time too. It may not be in a court setting, but gossip is a form of false witness. Also, blasting a story because it finally makes someone look bad that we already don't like, not okay unless we know that it's wrong. We just need to make sure that when we are talking about people, it is from a pure heart and not one that's trying to gain, and that it is a truthful statement. I will also say, though, that this has been weaponized lately. There's a lot of abuse is uncovered, and people are like, oh, that's false witness. Like, we don't get to just say you're bearing false witness against somebody just because we don't like what's being said. We do have to listen to other people and take into account what they were saying. A lot of people said, well, people were bearing false witness against Ravi Zacharias, and it turned out to be true. So we need to be really careful when we are calling other people out on this. And again, it just goes back to the principle, like, this is about you and the covenant community and what your responsibility is, and that is to always accurately reflect the people around you. If you don't know if it's a true story, you don't say it. And if someone else is saying something, don't automatically assume the worst, don't automatically assume the best. Just take it to God in prayer, and remember that it's similar to me to God deserves correct representation. We talked about it in the name command. And our neighbor also deserves correct representation. And if we can do that, then we also will get fair representation, because we all have had that experience of what it's like to have someone belittle or shame our character, say something that isn't true. And then a lot of other people believe it, and we're just standing there hurt. So remembering how it feels to be that person is always a good place to start. Finally, do not covet. In case you thought the principles of covenant commitment, I don't know how you would, were all just external matters. It really is. Like it gets back at the heart. It gets back at contentment. We talked about the last session how in Deuteronomy, Moses is very careful to say you must not covet your neighbor's wife, and then give another verb. The same verb, but to repeat it. You must not covet, and then list their property, because wives were treated as property. And he's making it very clear that in this community, the wife is not property. The wife is a person, and then there's the property. And it goes back to the theft, though, too. Are we content? Do we believe that God will take care of us? And goes back, I think, to the first and second principles. In that, what are we looking to for our security? Why do we want these things so bad? What is our security, and what's our hope in? What is our ultimate idea of the good life? I think sometimes contentment is so difficult for us because it seems like it's just so possible. Like it's just this close. We know what it would look like. You know, if we lived in a lot of these other countries, we would have, I think, a greater thirst for eternity, a greater hope. But here, it's like that good life, that, you know, the American dream, it's close. Or we might, you know, we're kind of living it and we're not even appreciative of it, but we think, oh, if I just make $20,000 more and get one more bedroom in that house and a new car, you're like, it's just close enough that we can see what we think is the ideal. And we forget that, like, God's like, oh, poor thing. I offer you so much more, like eternity with me. And the resurrection is so much more. A couple Sundays ago, Jeremy Buckner, in his sermon, quoted the famous C.S. Lewis line that we are far too easily pleased. We're like children playing in mud puddles because we don't know what's meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. Anything we could covet in this world is just a mud puddle. I promise you. I promise myself. It's just a mud puddle. Like, that's what you have to think. Like, whatever it is, it's just a mud puddle. And it doesn't compare with, if we circle back to the first one, to the principles that He is the Lord our God, who's brought us out of the land of slavery to bring us into a very good land.